a day after threatening to impose a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, Ontario Premier Doug Ford has agreed to suspend these charges. He's set to meet with the US Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick to discuss a renewed free trade deal. This comes after, of course, Donald Trump announced that he's reacting to Ford's tariff threat by increasing US duties on steel and aluminum from Canada to 50%. Let's bring in Thomas Timmins. He's head of energy at Gowling WLG. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a moving target. I know it seems to change from minute to minute.
It is indeed. Yeah.
Give us some perspective. So the Ontario sales of electricity to the United States, something like $700 million a year?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
So it's 1.5 million homes. So it's not nothing, but it's not a vast amount of their electricity.
No, that's right. Although we export roughly 90% of the U.S. imports, the U.S. only imports roughly between 1 and 1.5% of its power as a nation, believe it or not. That being said, our system impacts their system. Their system impacts our system. Mm-hmm. They are intimately connected.
Yeah, because, I mean, it's like the auto industry,
exactly.
It's like our food industries, the two are. So would this have been disruptive if the Premier had gone ahead with this thing?
It would have. And you know how you know that for certain, Andy? It got the president's attention. He responded right away, and he responded aggressively. So you know that it would have been disruptive. We don't know to what extent this would have added certainly to the cost. The threat of shutting off Ontario electricity, I think, was a much more substantial threat. Yep. I hope we don't get to that stage. So
yeah, Mr. Ford said, "I'll do that if necessary."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Where is this electricity generated, the Ontario Power? Is it nuclear or hydro?
It's a combination of both, plus also renewable assets and gas assets as well. So there's wind, there's solar, there are gas assets, there are gigantic nuclear assets, and then of course hydro stations that our grandparents and great-grandparents built, and they're all across the province. And they've been operating, for some of them, for more than 100 years.
And we typically have a surplus of electricity in Ontario?
That's right. We typically have a surplus, and we typically export into the United States. But that being said, sometimes we import. And that can change from day to day, from hour to hour, literally from moment to moment. So it flies back and forth across the border, and we really do rely on each other to keep our grids stable.
And generally for grids, it's good to share power, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah. It's good, absolutely good to have neighbors and to work well with your neighbors.
I know we can't get too deeply. Well, you're the man to discuss this with, but who owns this power, if you know what I mean? Who is the legal owner of this electricity?
Well, it's a fascinating question. It's a combination. So Ontario really does have an all-of-the-above energy generating network. And so we have assets that are owned by the public through Ontario Power Gen. We have assets that are privately held. We have assets that are publicly owned but privately operated. We have gas plants that are privately operated. We have wind farms that are privately operated. And often behind those privately owned assets, we have pension funds, life insurance companies, banks, teachers, bus drivers, like all of the above. So Ontarians, in many ways, often own a lot of these assets, either directly or indirectly.
And does the Premier have the power to just say, well, I'm putting an export tax on that electricity?
Well, I would be willing to bet that he's gotten a lot of good legal advice over the past few days. And you've actually seen it. If anyone cares to, you could actually track through the public statements. And the language has been very carefully couched in terms of what's being said. We're dealing with Canadian constitutional issues in terms of what crosses international borders becomes a matter in the federal realm versus the provincial realm. We're dealing with NERC, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, something that was established in 1965 after the Great Northeast Blackout of 65.
All right.
All of these reliability standards that we have to comply with. And the one thing that I'm reasonably confident of is that the provinces and the premiers and the various electricity system operators across Canada will comply with their obligations. That's one thing that I'm almost certain of.
It does seem tragic, isn't it? We've been cooperating for decades, and this dispute comes up, threatening to disrupt the relationship.
Yeah, it really is. And electricity is one of those commodities that is really vital. It's really nice to be able to turn on the heater on a cold March morning and to rely on the coffee maker running.
It's what distinguishes a rich industrial society from a developing one, I suppose, a poor one.
Something we have in common with our American cousins.
I know Trump was particularly irate, as you indicated in one of his social media posts. He says it's outrageous they threatened to cut off electricity.
Yeah, so we're going to hear all kinds of this ain't over, and we're going to hear more and more of that. And Andy, you can't write some of this stuff. I hope we don't go to the brink, literally, with shutting power off, because we really do rely on each other.
Yeah, because that would fracture the relationship
I think
for a long time.
Yeah, and that's just the Ontario story. Of course, across Canada, there are all the different grids and different grid operators, and there's a broader story in BC, in Alberta, in Manitoba, and of course in Quebec, which is a vast powerhouse.
Quebec is an even a bigger electricity exporter?
Yeah, and what's also interesting is this is, especially coming out of Quebec, it's all clean power. Right, it's all hydro. And that feeds down into the New England states and really keeps the lights on in places like Boston. So.
We don't want to mess with the Bostonians.
You certainly don't.
The New Englanders. Yeah. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to see you again.